Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and NARSAD, the Mental Health Research Association. Professor Redlich is a member of the advisory board on the Center on Wrongful Convictions of Youth and is active in the American Psychological Association, including serving on the executive committees of the American Psychology Law Society and the Society for Child and Family Practice and Policy. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Redlich.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. It's my honor to be here. I hope everybody is not too sleepy after lunch. I think this was supposed to be a panel, but somehow it turned out to be just me. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes or so, and I hope there's plenty of room for questions and such. The focus of my talk today is going to be on interrogation and intelligence techniques. What interrogators do. I'm going to review some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing. And so one way to describe interrogation techniques are in these kind of broad dichotomies. On the left-hand side, we have accusatorial, dominant, harsh, forcing. On the right-hand side, it's this information gathering, humane, friendly, rapport-based, where they pretty much all fall under the same umbrella. The forcing versus fostering is from the negotiation literature. The left-hand side, it always reminds me of the old fable. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, where the sun and the wind decide to have a contest. There's a man sitting on a bench and he's wearing a jacket, and the wind says, "I bet you I can get that man's jacket off quicker than you can," to the sun. And the sun says, "Okay, you're on." And the wind blows hard as he can, and what do you think happens? The man clutches his jacket in even further. He puts up resistance, and the wind blows even harder and harder, but all it does is it makes the man clutch his jacket harder and harder, where the sun starts beaming down and making it very warm and pleasant and friendly, and the man takes his jacket off. And I think that's a good analogy for what we have here on these dichotomies, is the wind versus the sun. Now, in the United States, interrogation is most often described as kind of this accusatorial approach. The investigator confronts the suspect, expresses a firm belief in his or her guilt. This idea of you don't interrogate someone unless you have this presumption of guilt, which I'll be going over in a little bit. They maximize the suspect's anxiety, and then they try to minimize the anxiety, and making a viable option to reduce this anxiety is to confess. In the United States, this is called the Reid technique. This was the first edition of this, came out in 1962, and it's been referred to as the Bible of police interrogation. It was cited in Miranda, and the reason partly why the Miranda decision came down in 1966 was because of the Reid technique. Actually, that's Fred Reid over there on the left-hand side. I couldn't find a picture of John Reid, but he's standing with the governor of Illinois at the time in 1968. Now, what's interesting is that the Reid technique developed almost directly out of stopping torture. So in the 1930s, and so in the United States is when there was a lot of cases and a commission around reducing or abolishing physical coercion in interrogations. There was the Brown versus Mississippi case in 1936. And we started seeing a shift from the third degree, and what you think of maybe as a stereotype of interrogation with rubber hoses and shining a bright light. We started moving to psychological methods of interrogation. And really, Fred Imbaugh was the forefront of this. And it was really cutting edge at the time. And it was actually seen as very liberal. So the Reed technique today, it's now in its 5th edition. The book actually has a 2013 date. It's out now. And on their website, it says, I don't know where to look, the Reed technique of interviewing, widely recognized as the most effective means to exonerate the innocent and identify the guilty. And this is because the Reed technique has been under a lot of fire as of late. Tomorrow, Professor Saul Kassin is going to be talking about false confessions. I'm not going to talk about false confessions too much today, just a tad. But the Reed technique has been highly criticized as producing false confessions. Now, they are a business, and they have to defend their business. So as of late, their new tagline is really this idea of their technique, their model, exonerates the innocent, identifies the guilty, and when false confessions occur, it's because of people who step outside of the Reed technique. Okay? And I think that's important to understand. So just about 2 weeks ago, I attended a conference in Toronto, and I got to hear Joe Buckley speak. Joe Buckley is the president of John Reed and Associates. And he went over, and I wanted to describe the Reed technique straight from the horse's mouth, if you will. So he described it as 3 different phases. The first phase is this idea of factual analysis, which is really just investigation, developing suspects, collecting evidence, all of those kind of things. The second phase is what's called the behavioral analysis interview. And I'm going to assume that most people don't know too much about interrogation, but in the US, there's 2 very distinct phases. There's between the interview and the interrogation. And these words connote very different things to interrogators and law enforcement. The BAI is meant to be non-accusatorial. It's an interview, and during this interview phase, the Reed techniques trains law enforcement to rely on nonverbal behavioral cues of deception, as well as verbal cues, use of contractions, things like that. Now, all of these are supposed to identify and separate out people who are guilty from people who are innocent. They also ask what are called behavior-provoking questions. And I brought a couple here with me today. This is something I always teach in some of my classes, little audience participation. So in the manual it says, Andy, what is your understanding for the purpose of this interview with me today? This is called the purpose question. So we have one suspect who says, well, last Sunday when the bookkeeping department was making out the deposit, they said that the deposit envelope from the men's department was missing, but I know for sure that I put it in the safe. So the reason I'm here is to prove that I didn't steal it. And you have another one who says, well, I guess they've misplaced the deposit envelope, and I'm just here to help them find out what might have happened to it. So one of these suspects is meant to be guilty, and one is meant to be innocent. So which one is guilty?
S1. S1.
S1. That's correct. You know, invariably, I always get a mixed response in my classes, and I actually always have to look it up in the manual. I'm like, because they have what I call as a stereotype of innocence, where innocent people are supposed to behave this way, and guilty people behave this way. Now, the thing about stereotypes, I do believe that the stereotypes come about for a reason. There is some kind of shared understanding, and so there may be some truth to this. But the problem with stereotypes is when you apply them equally to everybody, okay? Because sometimes innocent people might say, I'm already confused, the former rather than the later. And then there's the punishment question. Is what do you think should happen to the person who stole this $3,000? I don't know what the company policy is, it's not really up to me, versus whoever stole it should apologize to me for putting me through this, and then they should certainly be prosecuted. So who is innocent?
S1.
S1. No. No. S2. S2. And the reason that they report is because the person who is really guilty shouldn't be coming up with, they can't put themselves in that position and they don't want to get punished or prosecuted. Whereas the innocent person says, absolutely, they should go to prison, they should be prosecuted to the fullest extent, and those kind of things. Now this is very important to understand because the way police do this in the United States is if they determine that the person is indeed guilty, is when they will then go on to formally interrogate the suspect. And this is where the accusatory part really comes into play. And again, you know, the Reed technique claims that they don't interrogate innocent people because of this fact-finding mission in the first place. So, the 9 steps, I'm not really going to go over them, but it starts out with this direct positive confrontation. I know you're guilty, I just need you to tell me and fill up some of the details. I already know that that's the case. Then theme development, this is a very essential part of an interrogation. This is where the interrogator builds a theme where they place blame upon others. They make it morally acceptable for the person who they believe is guilty to accept responsibility. And this follows down the 9 steps all the way down into converting an oral confession into a written confession, which is the ultimate goal of an interrogation, is to get a confession. This is directly from the manual. This is this idea of, you know, it's very orchestrated, where they tell interrogators where to place suspects. It's what later I'll refer to as context manipulation. And just to make it a little less ambiguous, I've put some specific Reed techniques up here, things like bluff statements, where they may bluff about the evidence that they have, wherein a guilty person is going to know that this bluff is indeed real, whereas an innocent person is never going to fall for this bluff. But in fact, there have been false confession cases where that very thing has happened. They may play one suspect off of another, which is really the prisoner's dilemma. They condemn or blame others, you know, blame the victim, those kind of things. And then there's something called the alternative question, which is, you know, did you do this, did you steal because you were hungry, or did you steal because you were greedy? Where any answer, if you really truly answer the question, is going to make you guilty, but of course you're going to choose the option that makes you look more morally acceptable. That I was hungry. Now I want to talk briefly about, you know, what I just described was about criminal law interrogation. This is the Army Field Manual 2-22.3 is what is used in military interrogation. And on January 27, 2009, very soon after he was inaugurated, President Obama put together this executive order stating that any person under U.S. government control has to be interrogated within the confines of this Army Field Manual. They can't go beyond the bounds of this. They can't use any technique that's not within it. One thing that I think is somewhat contrasting between military and police interrogations is this idea of the direct approach. HUMINT stands for human intelligence. So all human collectors are supposed to start off with what's called the direct approach, which is just very straightforward, open-ended questions. And they're supposed to use this approach, the direct approach, until they believe that the person's being deceptive, giving them false information, so forth. And they claim in the Army Field Manual that in previous conflicts like Korea and the Vietnam War, that the direct approach is effective 90 to 95% of the time. But after the direct approach has run its course is when you start to get into the approaches and techniques within the Army Field Manual. They have a series of emotion-based approaches called love up, love or hate. So it could be love for your country, you play off of that, or it could be hate for somebody else's country, such as the US. Fear up, raising people's anxiety or bringing it down. You could be flattering them. or bringing their ego down, those kind of things that are more emotion-based. The incentive, the mutt and Jeff, which is really just good cop, bad cop. The we know all, pretty self-explanatory. And then the false flag, which is this idea of deception and posing as someone from another country. Now, contrast this with across the pond in the United Kingdom is what's called the information gathering approach. This is more of the Sun approach. And what happened here is back in the 1980s through the 1990s, the United Kingdom was experiencing a spate of false confession cases. And they really sat down and said, what are we doing wrong? They very much had a model that was very similar to the one I just described, the Reed model. And they came up with what's called a new ethos of interrogation. And it became labeled as the information gathering approach, where the idea is really to gather evidence, to seek the truth. People are trained that people may be innocent. There's not this idea of guilt presumption. Psychological coercion is prohibited, and it's really all about this idea of truth-seeking, and confessions are almost a bonus. It's focused on information gathering, and there's also special considerations for vulnerable people, which we don't really have here in the US. There's someone called an appropriate adult, has to be present, which could be an attorney, doesn't have to be, for juveniles and people with mental health, mental disabilities, really. And what's developed over time is called the peace model. This is really synonymous almost with the information gathering approach. And you can see what it stands for, but there's a great deal of planning and preparation, engage and explain, obtain the account, closure, a way of evaluating it, which is very important to saying, do I have independent corroboration of this? It's a very standardized approach where they've now have trained, it's law really, to train all law enforcement in this model in the United Kingdom, and also variants of this approach have been adopted in Australia and New Zealand and some other European countries. And keeping with kind of from the horse's mouth, also at this conference that I attended 2 weeks ago in Toronto, they had a master class on the peace model. And this is from what they say about the approach, that it's, the backbone of it is developing consistent and professional interviewers. It's grounded in psychological science. There's something called the cognitive interview, which researchers have been working on. Ron Fisher in particular for, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years right now. That's very much part of this method. And, it's really improved investigations overall and the overall quality. And like I said, it's very standardized. And I'm going to return to this later. And so I want to emphasize this point that, they put an emphasis on fidelity to this model, realizing that you could have training in this model, but if nobody follows it or there's not updates and those kind of things, then of course the method that they work so hard to develop is not going to work and may in fact lead to false confessions. So here are some specific techniques. It's just explain the purpose of the interview, explore the motive, intermittently summarize things, and challenge when necessary based on the evidence that was there. Just to summarize, to contrast these two, on the left-hand side we have accusatorial, it's psychologically manipulative, whereas information gathering is more direct. Controlling versus rapport-based, closed-end and confirmatory versus open-end and exploratory. And then I really didn't go over this, I did somewhat, the anxiety-based cues to deception versus this idea of cognitive-based cues to deception. And in fact, it's almost as if you could describe the accusatory style as anxiety-based overall. It's really meant to play off of people's anxiety, even the situation in the room where you really have, or meant to have no control. You're not in control of where the thermostat is. I mean, it's really that well orchestrated. Versus, I think the information gathering is more kind of a cognitive-based outsmarting the suspect, as opposed to playing off of their anxieties. So what I want to talk about next is a meta-analysis that I was involved with with my collaborators here, Chris Meisner, Jackie Evans, Sujita Bhatt, and Susan Brandon, where we conducted a systematic review of the interrogation and interviewing literature and to do some meta-analyses of contrasting the accusatorial versus the information gathering approach in terms of its effectiveness. And we had two strategies, or I should say there's really two strategies that you could go about this. And the first is looking at field research, where you have actual interrogations. People have conducted systematic studies where they had access to videotapes or transcripts, or they observed the interrogations themselves, versus we have laboratory research, which of course offers us more control and the ability to manipulate certain variables. So for the meta-analysis for the field studies, these were our eligibility criteria, where the intervention was that it had to be this systematic study. It couldn't just be kind of a vague musing or whatever. And they had to quantify at least one interrogation technique. The outcome, in the end, we had to actually rely on confessions as our outcome measure. We were hoping to actually include other kind of measures like amount of information and those kind of things, but we were really constrained by the literature, which I'll show you in a moment, is not as broad as you might think. So the outcome measure here in terms of effectiveness that we're dealing with is confession. And then our samples were suspects. And we located 29 studies, but in the end, only 5 of them were eligible. And the reason being is because we had to have data that took that interrogation technique and tied it to the confession outcome. Okay? So some studies may have just looked at confessions without looking at techniques, or vice versa, and some may have had both, but they made no link between the two, and we needed that link. So the studies that were represented, there were 3 in the United Kingdom, 1 in the US, and 1 in Canada. And then what we did is we coded for the presence of accusatorial methods, information gathering methods, or both. And these were just some of the sample tactics that we coded for. And this is the first kind of theme of my talk, is that we pretty soon into this realized that there's not this dichotomy, that it might be a false dichotomy that people have established, that, because there are definite techniques that you could categorize into both methods, such as the ones listed here. So what we found, this is what's called a forest plot, and I'm going to be summarizing this in a minute. But basically what's important to understand is anything that's to the right of the 0 mostly means that it was significantly more likely to produce confessions. Anything that's to the left of it means that it was negatively related to the production of confessions. And anything that crosses that line means it's not related, okay? And so what we found is that for both accusatorial and the information gathering methods were significantly produced confessions, okay? The techniques that were categorized as both did not have an effect. But as you can see here, we had a lot of holes, and there's not that many studies. So, just to summarize, we found that both methods were associated with a significant increase in the likelihood of confessions, whereas both were not. However, the number of studies is small, and we don't know anything about the veracity of the confessions. It could be that both methods, accusatorial or information gathering, is increasing the rate of true and false confessions, this idea of diagnosticity. Which is this idea that we want techniques that produce true confessions, but don't produce false confessions. Okay? And that's the beauty of experimental studies, where you can manipulate guilt and innocence, and you know the ground truth, where in these field studies you have a confession, but you don't really know if it's true or false. So the intervention here, they had to contrast, these studies had to contrast either accusatorial with a control method or accusatorial versus information gathering. And the outcome could be true confessions, it could be false confessions, or it could be both. And again, we had 22 papers or studies, but only 12 of them met this criteria. And as you can see here, most of them were in this idea of control versus accusatorial, and most of them were looking at false confessions. Okay? Is everybody with me still? Great. So what we're finding here, and this is our biggest samples, is we're finding that most of it is on the right side of the zero, where it is producing control versus accusatorial. Accusatorial is significantly producing both true and false confessions. If we look at control versus information gathering, we're seeing that it produces true confessions, but it doesn't really have an effect on false confessions. There's no significant relationship. And then if we look at accusatorial versus information gathering, we see that the information gathering is producing the true confessions, where the accusatorial is producing the false confessions. So to make that clear and to summarize, the accusatorial compared to control, it produces more true confessions and more false confessions. And control, basically, it was the absence of the accusatorial method. So, for instance, the accusatorial method could be the presentation of false evidence, which is lying to suspects. So the control condition in that was just not lying to suspects. Control versus information gathering, we see that information gathering produces more true confessions, but not more false. And then when we pit the two against each other, we see more true confessions and fewer false confessions with the information gathering. So the experimental studies suggest rather significant benefits in the use of the information gathering approach for the elicitation of true confessions, as well as the reduction of false confessions. This idea of increased diagnosticity, which is really the goal of all interrogators. However, of course, the number of studies is still small at this point. So one of the things that I think was raised for me during this meta-analysis is whether or not, like I said, is it a false dichotomy? Are we more seeing it on a continuum of styles where it's the information gathering versus accusatorial all the way at the other end? So my colleagues in my lab and I are now developing what we've been calling a taxonomy of interview and interrogation techniques. And when we've reviewed the literature, in part because of this meta-analyses, we see things two kind of opposite extremes. One is this idea of very broad dichotomy, like I went over in the beginning, this kind of accusatorial versus information gathering, or dominant versus humane. And all the way at the other end, we see very specific techniques, and we don't see anything in the middle. So it's either overly broad or overly narrow. And taxonomy is the science of classification, so we think that the interrogation literature and the techniques themselves could use this mid-level to help guide the research and insight. So my colleagues here are my postdoc, Christopher Kelly, who will be on the job market. He's awesome. Janae Miller and Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Kleinman. And because of this meta-analysis, we really had access to what we felt was a comprehensive literature with published and unpublished studies and government sources and so forth. And we first found there was about 800 techniques that we were able to whittle down into 71 techniques. I know that's a big leap, and I'm happy to talk to you about it later, but I won't bore you with the details. We came up with 6 domains that we sorted these 71 techniques into. And what we did is we organized the literature, and I'm not meaning for you to read this or understand it even, but what we did is we laid everything out on a spreadsheet and we color-coded, and because there's a lot of duplicity. There's a lot of techniques that, the military use this language and the criminal world use this language, or in the United Kingdom they say this. And so we just tried to match up the same techniques, and that's partially how we whittled it down. And so we came up with these 6 domains, rapport and relationship building. I'll go over these in a minute. And what we think about these domains is that, like I said, we tried to do a very comprehensive job of this, but we feel that even if, we miss some techniques, or there's new techniques that are going to be developed, we feel that these 6 domains are comprehensive, and that they would capture and could encapsulate new techniques or missed techniques. So the first is this idea of rapport and relationship building, which is extremely important to an interrogation. And we kind of define it as this working relationship between the operator and the source in trying to determine a mutually shared goal, a working understanding. And I think there's 19 techniques in there, and those are just 2 of the specific techniques that we put in there. The next one is this idea of emotion manipulation, and it includes a lot of those techniques that I showed you in the Army Field Manual, the fear up, fear down, those kind of things. Next is this idea of context manipulation, like that slide I showed you about how to set up the room. So it's an idea of conducting the interview in a small room, positioning the detainee in a specific place, away from the door, those kind of things. It could also be temporal manipulation. Then there's confrontation and competition. And this is where you just as it sounds, you emphasize your authority and expertise over the detainee or the suspect, and you use deception. Then there's this idea of collaboration, where, kind of the opposite of confrontation and competition. You offer special rewards, like cigarettes or candy, or you show concern for the detainee in a situation. And finally, there is this idea of presentation of evidence, where it could be presenting the suspect with actual evidence of his guilt, or it could be bluffing or lying about false evidence that you really don't have. How am I doing on time? What time do I have until? 2:45, okay. Thank you. So, what we did next is I'm going to tell you about some surveys that we've been doing, where we've taken these 6 domains that we've created and used them to survey the interrogation community. And again, here are my collaborators, Chris Kelly, Janae Miller, and Professor David Bailey, who is many of you may know, he's an internationally recognized policing scholar. And this is work that's supported by the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, or what's known as HIG. And if you don't know, this is an initiative another initiative by Obama, where he was really trying to take the interrogation realm out of the CIA's hands and put it more in the White House. And it's an interagency group that includes the FBI, it's housed within the FBI, the Department of Defense, and the CIA. And it's really got 2 main purposes. The first is to create an elite group of interrogators who can be deployed at a moment's notice when there is a high-value detainee terrorism suspect, for instance. And the second is really this research component, which you gotta love Obama. It's to study the comparative effectiveness of interrogation approaches and techniques, with the goal of identifying the most effective existing techniques and developing new lawful techniques. Okay, and so the research that we're involved with is really to address this mission, is to ask the experts themselves. And so I just put up a little cartoon where it says, after you confess, can you fill out this survey to help us improve our interrogation method? Okay, and so there's actually, we've been doing this for a couple of years, and the first year we surveyed U.S. interrogators. They were both military and criminal law enforcement. And the second year, which is actually ongoing, is our international sample. It includes some, very few at this moment, U.S. Interrogators. This year, too, is actually what I'm going to focus on today. But it is ongoing, and we're still looking for more countries to participate. You can see that right now our year 2 sample is all criminal law enforcement. They do have a lot of experience overall. And these are the countries that we have participating to date. Most of them are Canadian. We have some from Great Britain, Ireland, a few others. I think I communicated with Chris today, and we're up even farther. Now we have some people from the Netherlands, and we've been able to connect with the RCMP in Canada. They've been great. We've been able to connect with the Garda in Ireland, but we still have some work to do. So instead of describing each country, because there's so many countries that it would be useless, pointless, what I'm going to do is I'll get to that in a moment, sorry. Just want to describe what we did briefly is we asked them about their demographics and experiences, training, and the number of interrogations and those kind of things. The main thing that I'm going to talk about today is the frequency of techniques, how often they use certain techniques, which we think are very closely tied to the perceived effectiveness of the techniques. Because it stands to reason that if you think a technique is ineffective, you're not going to use it. But if you think it's effective, you're going to use it all the time. And then we created 3 different vignettes. And these vignettes were a response to create some kind of context. Because we do think that the perceived effectiveness or reported usage of any one interrogation technique is really going to vary depending on who's sitting in front of you. So I just want to set that up. And then we did ask some other kind of questions that I won't be going over today. But the independent variable that I'm going to use for the rest of this talk is this scale that we created, this idea of the continuum where 1 is information gathering and 10 is accusatorial. So we set it up and we said, interview and interrogation practices can vary dramatically by country. Although overly simplistic, some countries use an information gathering approach, truth-seeking, inquisitorial, focus on listening to suspects, whereas others use a more accusatorial approach, confrontational, psychologically manipulative, don't allow denials, etc. So using this scale, how would you characterize your country's interrogation style? And they rated on a scale of 1 to 10. And then we asked them, how would you rate your own interrogation style using the same scale? And this is what we found. And if it were a true dichotomy, obviously we would have 50% here on number 1 and 50% here on number 10. And this is for your country style. And then this is just mapping on their own style. And we can see even that a person's own style doesn't really map on 1-to-1 on their country style. And you can see it's almost this regression to the mean where the people with information gathering style countries want to see themselves slightly more accusatorial, and the people who are accusatorial in their country want to go and be more information gathering. Okay? And what we did here is to use it as this independent variable is we created a median split. So people with their own style, not the country style, who got a 1, 2, or who said they were 1, 2, or 3, I'm going to label as information gathering. Whereas people who got 4, 5, 6, or 8, that nobody wanted to be a 7 for some reason, I'm labeling accusatorial, but of course these are just labels. And I just wanted to point out that it's, especially these first 2 columns where we have more participants of Canada and Great Britain, it's not simply a matter of all the British people are at this end of the scale and all the others are at this end. It is something that seems to be own personal interrogator style. Where in Canada, 54% of themselves are on this other end of the scale, and the other half are on the more the accusatorial style. So what we see here is what I did is, there were a total of 71 techniques that they had to rate on a scale of 1 to 5. I never use it all the way to I always use it. And so I just looked at the top 5, and then I looked at it, the differences between these two median split. And you can see here that there are some differences, but these I would characterize as more of your friendly son techniques, if you will. The 4 out of the 5 are in the rapport and relationship building phase. But you can see here, with the exception of build a bond, that the accusatorial are slightly more, they use these techniques slightly more. Now if you look at the bottom 5 frequencies, you can see here some more prominent differences between the two different styles. And and you can see that these are they're used less often for sure, but the more confrontational techniques, the harsher, the wind type techniques, they're used less often by both groups, but they're used more often by the accusatorial, which I guess you could say is some kind of validity. And then here, if we look at the domain frequencies by their own style, we see here that across all the domains, there's some medium to large effect size differences in that the accusatorial are using more techniques than the information gathering folks. Okay? And so I just wanted to talk briefly about one of the vignettes. This was the vignette where the detainee is, what happens is if you, early on in the survey, you say, I'm from the US, I'm from Canada, I'm from Finland, and then it would come up with, I'm a 20-year-old Canadian-born Caucasian male, so it matched their country. Okay, so it's really talking about your country, and it's this whole situation. The suspect or the detainee is described as being belligerent. He's found with documents on his person. He's considered a high-value detainee, and you want to get some tactical intelligence from him. And so then respondents had the option of all 71 techniques. They could check off what techniques you would use with this person given this situation. And there was something about, you've done the direct approach, which we defined for them, and that's run its course. Now what interrogation techniques would you use given this context? And this is what we found. Really no difference between, for the rapport and relationship building. But again, we're seeing this very similar pattern where the accusatorial people are using more techniques, and this is a percentage within the domain itself. They're using more techniques than the information gathering approach style. Did I get rid of that? I guess I didn't. Okay. And so if you're noticing a pattern, I notice this pattern, it really is a matter of the accusatorial using more techniques. There was across for each vignette, if you take it out of the context of the domains, the accusatorial are just simply using more techniques. It's almost as if, it made me think of, just throwing things against the wall and seeing what works. I'm going to use all these different techniques, and then I'll see which one works the best. Whereas the information gathering are just using fewer techniques. So to conclude, interrogators have different styles that may not map onto their own country style. Like I said, they use more than the information gathering. I just wanted to go back to this one again. And I thought long and hard about this, because this was kind of an interesting finding to me, at least, that the accusatorial style is using more techniques, and this was borne out too in the frequency of usage results. But I think there may be two things going on. The first is that the information gathering approach, if you think about it, they have a whole set of techniques, the confrontational techniques, that have been taken away from them. They are, they're trained not to use them. They're trained that they're illegal. So that could be one explanation. A second is that and this is kind of what I alluded to before, the information gathering approach is much more standardized. It's science-based. There is a great emphasis on training and fidelity to the model, like I was talking about before. Whereas certainly with the Reed technique and with other variants of the Reed technique, at least from what I've seen, it's not as standardized. It's much looser. The training is not as standardized as the information gathering approach. And it kind of speaks to what Joe Buckley is now saying about defending the Reed technique, is that it's not the Reed technique, it's everybody who uses it and steps out of the bounds. And so during his talk 2 weeks ago, I asked him, I said, given that this is your current stance, do you feel any kind of responsibility or kind of, for getting people to have more fidelity with your model? And he really just didn't answer me, is the best that I can say about that. And I think it's partly because it's definitely an experience-based method. It's not a science-based method. And I think he would agree with me with that. The last conclusion is that the data that I showed you is really just a smattering of a few westernized countries. And we really don't know that much about interrogation, at least from a systematic survey method, at least, of other non-Western countries. So what I'm going to do is I'll just wrap up quickly about, I'm working with a political scientist at Albany who turned me on to this data set, and it's called the Syria Human Rights Database, and it was developed by two political scientists, and it represents 195 countries, and not all, but most of the countries have data points from 1981 to 2009, representing 29 years. And they go over a series of rights, physical integrity rights, civil liberties, and so forth. And they're only included in the database if they consider them to be reliable and systematic data. And so one of the physical integrity rights that they have is the use of torture. Okay, and this is the way they define torture in the data set. So it's this purposeful inflicting of extreme pain, whether mental or physical, by government officials or private people at the instigation of government. It's cruel, inhumane, or degrading. And it could also include deaths in custody due to negligence by government officials. And so for each of these 29 years, they assigned a 0, 1, or 2, where 0 is no instance of torture in that year, 1 was occasional practice of torture, and 2 was frequent practice of torture. Okay, and so what I did is I just took a mean, and we see here on the left-hand side is our year 2 sample, so the countries that I presented some data on. And you can see here that their means over the 29 years are all below 1. Where if you look at some other countries, and I really did randomly choose them, well, somewhat randomly, but if you look at Iraq as a 2, so every single year, in 29 years, they received a 2. China, Iran, Brazil, all 1.93, Mexico, Israel, and Japan. Japan is an outlier, where it's more akin to the mostly North American and European countries. And I really tried to find out more information about the interrogation styles, and there's certainly some case studies or some news reports and those things, which is how this database was compiled. But we really don't know that much about interrogation in these non-Western countries. And so, a lot of people think that because we're not using torture in the United States, that we're really coddling terrorist suspects. And if you ask people like Matthew Alexander or George Pirro or Ali Soufan, they're going to say that it's these Sun techniques, that those are the most effective. They do not endorse torture perhaps because they think it's immoral, but more so because they do not view it as effective. So expert interrogators, our very successful expert interrogators, do not endorse these wind-based techniques, but more of the sun techniques. So I think we may have to even extend our continuum further to include torture at the other end, and really determine what other countries are doing. So I'll just wrap up by a few take-home messages. The information gathering, preliminary, more effective than accusatorial. However, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. There's very few studies that found there were reliable conclusions, but very few studies. The information gathering accusatorial, I'd say it's more of a style continuum than an either-or dichotomy. The survey results, they use more, accusatorial uses more techniques than the information gathering style, which I think is really fascinating, and I may pursue it now. The country interrogator style is not a clear one-on-one mapping, and we just know very little about non-Western countries, and I will say thank you and end it there.
We can take some questions. Yes, in front, sir.
Hi, my name is Antoine Jones. I'm from John Jay College Criminal Justice.
Hello.
I wanted to ask you if you came across any American police districts or areas that have tried information gathering as a technique approach to try to improve rates of confessions.
That's an excellent question. There's not a lot of data out there upon that. This question that I had on the continuum of the info gathering to accusatorial, we didn't ask it in the year one survey, but I'm really regretting it right now because there aren't good data on there that there are some individual interrogators. I can't remember his name in Minnesota that are kind of anti-Reed, if you will, and they themselves, I think, have gotten a false confession in the past, and so they're now kind of believers of more of this information gathering approach. So one, the answer to your question is I don't think there's good data on that, and two, I think there's some interesting anecdotes, but for the most part, I would say U.S. interrogation is really the Reed technique or variants of the Reed technique.
Hopefully, two quick questions. The data set that you used, or at least your examples with the detainee, it seems to include both criminal and then a detainee, which are two separate categories where different rules might apply, as you know. I mean, how do you separate that out? I mean, in the detainee situation, there may be techniques available that were not available on the criminal side of the house. Did you look at that to see if that would explain any of the results that you got?
I didn't present these data, but in our U.S. sample, we did have military, people who labeled themselves military versus people who labeled themselves as criminal interrogators. And we really found no differences. And early on, when we were developing this survey, we got all this feedback about our goals are different, and I had this great quote that I didn't show, but a military interrogator said, I don't interview people, I interrogate people. So we knew we were dealing with these language barriers and those kind of things. But in fact, what the data were saying to me is that there was really this perception out there that we have different goals, and therefore we're going to use different techniques, but we were not finding that. And in response to this early feedback that we were getting, we had a specific section on, what techniques do you use for these 4 different goals. We had the goal of getting a confession or prosecution, gathering intelligence, and then a strategic versus or tactical. And again, we found no differences for the usage of techniques across those 4 outcomes and between criminal and military. And I think what I'm learning, from developing this talk and learning from this idea is I think, we're collapsing across these different styles, and that may be what it is. It's not this criminal military distinction, but it is that some criminal falling on the continuum and the military, they're falling in different places, and I think that's maybe where we're finding the differences. Hi.
Hi, my name's Ira Bell. I'm from the Ford Foundation. I wonder if you considered using data from the Innocence Projects, their data on false confessions, and what type of interrogation methods were more likely to lead to false confession in those
It's an
cases.
excellent idea, but I'm afraid I've been scooped. So other people have done that. In fact, Saul Casson comes to mind, where and then there's a professor, Brandon Garrett, at the University of Virginia, where they've looked at the tactics of, I think we can learn a lot from the Innocence Project cases, but I always view it as a very specific subsample of wrongful convictions, and I think the factors that made them identified in the first place as wrongful convictions make them a special subset. And I always feel a little bit nervous about drawing conclusions from this specialized subset of wrongful convictions that seem to have many factors merging that therefore lead to their identification as wrongful convictions. So.
Two related questions, issues. One about the validity of your self-report. For example, the language rapport-based, the APA, in terms of the context of national security interrogations, was pushing rapport-based interrogations, but it turns out that meant very harsh and sometimes brutal things were called rapport-based. And in many contexts, anything that follows the Army Field Manual is called rapport-based, even Appendix M-based interrogations. So I'm wondering, given this language kind of issue, the validity of these self-reports and whether you're telling more about how people perceive themselves than what they actually do. And then somewhat related to that, it seems there's a major factor, which is that you're treating interrogation style as essentially almost like as a trait variable, but there's the context, and the context of pressure to get convictions in certain cases, pressure to get intelligence. So in Guantanamo, we have hundreds of innocent people with incredible pressure to get something that would justify their being there, and or so-called intelligence that people didn't have. And same in Iraq, where literally thousands of people were rounded up with very little information, with no way of telling who was who, and the interrogators were under great pressure. So it seems to me that the context of the pressures is a major determinant of what people do.
Well, yeah, you said a lot there, so let me try to take a step back. In terms of self-report, yeah, there's definitely limitations to self-report. And one limitation may be that the people who completed or who chose to complete our survey, of course it was voluntary as well as anonymous, was maybe people who used more of these, what we labeled, and I think that's an important point in terms of this rapport relationship, is we took specific techniques and we adhered that label of rapport and relationship building. In terms of the different languages, I was trying to speak to that earlier, is that, that was something that we recognized early on, and, I'd like to think that we put a lot of thought and effort into actually developing this survey, because we were getting this feedback about language issues, and, one of our goals, which we've kind of abandoned, was to create this lexicon of interrogation, because people do use different terms. And then, the idea of context, well, that's exactly what we are trying to do with these vignettes, because I do think that, like I said, that the idea of this, I think that this technique is effective with this person, but I don't think it's effective with this person, and I'm not going to use it. And I didn't show the other vignettes, I kind of skipped through those slides, but we are finding that depending on the context, there, like especially in our first US sample, there were very different techniques applied depending on whether our first vignette was a Pakistani male, our second was this American male, you know, which we varied a lot of different things though. And the third was actually I think it was an Afghanistan woman who they really wanted information about her sons. She had some information about intelligence about her son's whereabouts and those kind of things. And we really found interesting differences across the domains, not across interrogator style, like I said, between criminal, military, or other attributes like age or experience or anything like that. But there were, depending on who was in front of you, there were some interesting differences. Of course, with the survey, you know, we were trying to keep it brief. We couldn't, you know, do all these kind of different contexts, but that was our attempt to address it.
Hi, I'm Raj from the other part of the world. I'm from Singapore, and I wanted to thank you for that really interesting presentation. I don't really have a question, but I have a comment. One of the things that we are looking at with regards to interviewing is the role of culture, because from our own experience working with high-value detainees in Indonesia and some of our work within that part of the world and that region, we realize that sometimes you can look at culture as part of a response to build rapport. And if you can use that effectively, sometimes you find that rapport is effectively enhanced and you get a good interview going. And that's one of the things that we've been exploring. And I thought that would be an interesting angle from your meso perspective, you know, the middle level that you were talking about, and as part of rapport building. So just a perspective.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, one of the things that we've taken from this survey is to pick up on this idea of culture. And you know, I think a lot of people are starting to realize how important that is. And there was a series of questions that we asked where we said is sorry, I'm trying to phrase this correctly. Interrogator attributes. Is it are you successful or more or less successful depending on if the detainee is the same age as you or older than you, same culture as you? And what we were finding is when the person in front of them was different in multiple characteristics, including, you know, lots of different parts of culture, they didn't view anything as effective. So it begs the question: what do you see as effective when the person sitting across from you is from a different culture? So I think it's a very important area for future research. Okay, well, 5 minutes short.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.